The encounter. Marcus Campbell pulled his jet-black sedan into the courthouse parking lot, scanning the rows of cars for a free spot. The sun beat down relentlessly, the asphalt shimmering in the heat. His mind was already on the case, an important trial that could shift his career to the next level. He adjusted his rearview mirror, his well-fitted suit rustling softly as he leaned forward, eyes catching an open spot near the front. With a flick of his blinker, Marcus turned toward it. Just as his car eased forward, a sleek silver SUV cut sharply in front of him. Tires screeched, and Marcus slammed on the brakes, his heart thumping in his chest from the close call. His car jolted to a halt, missing the SUV by mere inches. Marcus's knuckles tightened around the steering wheel as he stared at the offending vehicle, now carelessly parked across two spaces. Before Marcus could fully process what just happened, the SUV door flew open, and out stepped a tall, broad-shouldered man in an expensive gray suit. Aviator sunglasses perched arrogantly on his head, and he moved with the casual entitlement of someone used to being above reproach. The man adjusted his tie as he strode toward Marcus's car with a kind of self-assured swagger that came from years of never being questioned. "Hey, you nearly hit me," the man barked, slamming the SUV door behind him. His voice cut through the thick summer air, sharp and accusatory. Marcus rolled down his window halfway, blinking in disbelief. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," the man snapped, stopping just shy of Marcus's window. "You need to pay more attention on the road. Almost caused an accident there, buddy." Marcus's eyebrows raised in disbelief. He forced himself to remain calm despite the simmering frustration bubbling under his skin. "I had my signal on for that space. You cut me off." The man tilted his head, his expression twisting into a smug smile, as if Marcus had said something utterly ridiculous. "Well, maybe you should have been quicker. Life moves fast, doesn't it?" Marcus bit back the retort on the tip of his tongue, reminding himself to stay composed. This wasn't the first time someone like this, entitled and arrogant, had assumed he could treat Marcus like he didn't matter. "You were in the wrong," Marcus said, keeping his voice even. "You saw my signal. You almost caused a wreck." The man gave a dismissive chuckle, resting one hand on the roof of Marcus's car as if he owned the entire situation. "Look, you'll survive. Just find another spot. No need to make a big deal out of it." Marcus inhaled deeply, clenching the steering wheel tighter. The man's words weren't just dismissive. They dripped with condescension, as if Marcus was nothing more than a minor inconvenience in his day. "Nice car," the man added, casting a pointed glance at Marcus's sedan. "Didn't expect to see someone like you driving that." Marcus's jaw tightened at the subtle jab hidden in the man's compliment. "Someone like me? You know what I mean," the man said with a smirk, glancing at Marcus's dark skin and expensive suit. "I don't see many people like you in rides like this. Must have got lucky, huh? Lottery ticket, or maybe a rental." Marcus fought to keep his expression neutral, but anger burned hot in his chest. It was the same old insult, wrapped in thinly veiled racism, an assumption that his success had to be some kind of fluke. "You don't know anything about me," Marcus said quietly, though his voice carried the weight of years of similar encounters. The man gave a condescending laugh. Sure. I've seen plenty of your type. Flashy car, nice suit, probably landed a decent job by accident. But deep down, it's all show, isn't it?" Marcus stared at the man, his calm demeanor masking the fire building inside him. He wasn't going to give this man the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. "You might want to be careful," Marcus warned, his voice low and steady. "You don't know who you're talking to." For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty passed through the man's smug expression. He shifted his stance but quickly recovered, offering a dismissive shrug. Yeah, whatever. Enjoy your day while it lasts." With that, the man gave Marcus's car roof 2 patronizing taps, as if dismissing him entirely, and strutted back to his SUV. humming a jaunty tune under his breath. Marcus sat motionless for a moment, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. He closed his eyes and took a long, measured breath, reminding himself what mattered. This man was irrelevant. The trial inside the courthouse, however, that was what he needed to focus on. After a moment, Marcus shifted his car into gear, found another parking spot, and turned off the engine. Grabbing his briefcase from the passenger seat, he adjusted his tie, straightened his shoulders, and stepped out into the scorching heat. As he walked toward the courthouse, he let the encounter fall away, his mind zeroing in on the task at hand. The case he was fighting today wasn't just important for his client, it was personal. It represented everything he stood for: justice, hard work, and proving that people like him belonged in every room, whether or not others believed it. The marble floors of the courthouse echoed with the sound of his polished shoes as he strode toward the courtroom. He nodded at a few familiar faces, fellow attorneys who returned the gesture with brief, respectful acknowledgments. Marcus had earned his place here, no matter what people like the man from the parking lot thought. Pushing open the heavy wooden doors, Marcus entered the courtroom and scanned the room. The judge was seated at the bench, clerks and assistants bustled around, and his opposing counsel hadn't arrived yet. Marcus set his briefcase down and laid out his notes, organizing them with precision. Just as Marcus finished setting up, the courtroom doors swung open again. He glanced up and froze. In walked the man from the parking lot, his gray designer suit crisp, sunglasses now tucked into his pocket. The swagger was still there, but this time it looked forced. Marcus's lips twitched into the slightest of smiles. The man, Jonathan Price, a high-profile corporate lawyer, was his opponent for the day. Jonathan's eyes scanned the room, his confident smirk in place, until they landed on Marcus. The recognition hit Jonathan like a slap, and for a brief moment, his mask of arrogance slipped. His steps faltered, and he blinked in surprise. Marcus didn't say a word. He simply gave Jonathan a polite professional nod, as if the encounter in the parking lot had never happened. Jonathan's face twitched with a mixture of embarrassment and frustration. Well, he muttered under his breath, "This should be interesting." Marcus smiled coolly. "Yes," he replied, "it should." Without another word, Marcus turned back to his notes. The battle had already begun, and this time, the playing field was his. A crack in the armor. Marcus sat in the courtroom, mentally reviewing his argument. He took a long breath, steadying himself. He knew his role here was bigger than just legal advocacy. In many ways, his presence challenged the perceptions held by men like Jonathan Price, people who judged him based on his skin and ignored the competence behind his suit. He wasn't just here to fight a case. He was here to prove a point, that integrity, precision, and preparation were far more powerful than privilege. The case they were about to argue was a corporate liability matter. Marcus was representing a group of employees alleging wrongful termination and discrimination against a large tech corporation. These employees claimed they were let go without proper cause, and the records indicated alarming patterns of race-based bias. Jonathan Price, a hotshot lawyer known for defending high-profile corporations, was brought in by the tech company to shut this case down. Jonathan had built his career by playing on technicalities, overwhelming the opposition with endless paperwork, and using his charm to sway judges and juries. But the cracks were starting to show, at least to Marcus. That earlier confrontation in the parking lot had disrupted Jonathan's usual rhythm, and Marcus intended to exploit that weakness with precision. The court clerk called for order, and the judge returned to the bench, his gavel echoing across the room. "Mr. Williams, we'll hear your witness now," the judge said, glancing down at the docket. Marcus rose, adjusting his tie. "Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to call Mrs. Angela Thompson to the stand." From the back of the room, a middle-aged woman stood and walked toward the witness stand. Angela had been a mid-level manager at the defendant corporation, and she had witnessed the company's discriminatory practices firsthand. Her testimony was crucial in tying together Marcus's argument. Angela took the oath, her hand steady, but her expression serious. Marcus smiled at her briefly, offering reassurance. "Mrs. Thompson," Marcus began, "could you tell the court how long you worked at the company in question?" 15 years, Angela replied, her voice clear. "And in your experience, did the company have fair employment practices?" Angela hesitated for a beat, glancing at the jury before continuing. "No. In recent years, I noticed they began targeting certain employees, those of color, for layoffs and demotions. It became clear that people like me were being pushed out." Marcus nodded. "And did you raise any concerns about this pattern with your supervisors?" "I did," Angela said, her voice hardening. "I filed 2 internal complaints. Both were ignored. They told me it was just standard restructuring, but it wasn't. I saw good, hard-working employees getting fired while others, less qualified, were promoted." Marcus leaned in, his tone steady. "And when you continued to raise these concerns, what happened to you?" Angela's gaze darkened. "They let me go. After 15 years, they gave me 2 weeks' notice." A hush fell over the courtroom. Jonathan shifted uncomfortably at his table, tapping a pen against his legal pad. Marcus glanced toward him, catching the subtle twitch in the other lawyer's jaw. Jonathan's earlier bravado had dimmed, and Marcus could see the man grappling with the realization that this case wasn't as easy as he had thought. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson," Marcus said, stepping back slightly. "No further questions, Your Honor." The judge nodded. "Mr. Price, your witness." Jonathan stood, buttoning his suit jacket and walking to the center of the room. His usual swagger was diminished, but he tried to hide it with forced confidence. "Mrs. Thompson," Jonathan began smoothly, "I understand your frustration. Losing a job after so many years must have been difficult." Angela kept her expression neutral. "It was." Jonathan smiled, but there was no warmth behind it. "Would it be fair to say that perhaps you misunderstood the company's intentions? Restructuring is difficult for everyone, and sometimes these decisions are purely financial, not personal." Angela didn't flinch. "I didn't misunderstand anything, Mr. Price. When half the people being fired look like me, it's hard to miss the pattern." The jury stirred at her words, and Jonathan's smile faltered. He shifted on his feet, clearly searching for a way to regain control of the situation. "Surely," Jonathan pressed, "the company wouldn't risk such blatant bias. Isn't it possible they were simply focused on productivity metrics?" Angela tilted her head, unimpressed. "Productivity metrics. I was one of their top performers. So were the others who were let go." Marcus suppressed a smile as Jonathan faltered again, fumbling with his notes. The earlier arrogance Jonathan had displayed in the parking lot had entirely evaporated. Now, standing before Angela and the jury, he looked more like a man desperately grasping at straws. Jonathan cleared his throat and forced a smile. "No further questions, Your Honor." He retreated to his seat, shoulders visibly tense. Marcus could tell that the encounter in the parking lot wasn't just a fleeting incident for Jonathan. It had lodged itself in the man's mind. And now every misstep in court was compounding that earlier humiliation. As Jonathan sat down, Marcus leaned back slightly, a quiet sense of satisfaction settling over him. He wasn't the type to gloat, but seeing Jonathan unravel in real time was undeniable proof of the shift in power. The man who had dismissed Marcus as someone beneath him in the parking lot was now struggling to keep up, both in court and in his own mind. The judge announced a brief recess, and the lawyers gathered their papers. As Marcus stood to stretch, he felt a presence approach from the side. It was Jonathan, his expression a strange mix of irritation and something that almost looked like regret. "Williams," Jonathan muttered under his breath. "About earlier. I didn't know you were." Marcus cut him off, his voice low but firm. "It doesn't matter, Price. What matters is the case." Jonathan opened his mouth as if to argue but then closed it, realizing there was no point. The man who had strutted through the parking lot, full of superiority, was now just another lawyer grasping for an edge he no longer had. The courtroom resumed after the break, and Marcus settled back into his seat, ready to continue dismantling Jonathan's defense. As the next witness was called, Marcus couldn't help but reflect on the irony of the situation. The real battle hadn't been fought in the parking lot. It was unfolding right here, in a courtroom where talent and preparation trumped arrogance and assumptions. And Marcus was winning. The game of strategies. As the afternoon sunlight slanted through the courtroom windows, the energy in the room shifted. Marcus could feel the tension growing. And that tension was something he thrived on. Every trial had its rhythm. A dance between offense and defense, pressure and poise. Right now, the rhythm was favoring him. Jonathan Price was out of sync, struggling to regain control. Marcus knew better than to let him breathe. The best way to keep someone like Price off balance was to press even harder. The next witness on Marcus's list was David Rodriguez, a former senior data analyst at the defendant corporation. David had been instrumental in proving the statistical bias that Marcus intended to introduce as evidence. It was the linchpin of his case. If he could show the pattern through cold, irrefutable numbers, the corporation's restructuring excuse would fall apart like a house of cards. The clerk swore David in, and the witness took his seat. He looked nervous but determined, his thick-rimmed glasses catching the light. Marcus stood, letting the moment linger just enough to set the tone. "Mr. Rodriguez," Marcus began smoothly, "you were employed by the defendant corporation for how long?" 8 years, David replied, fidgeting slightly with the hem of his jacket. "And during your time there, you were responsible for compiling performance metrics across departments. Is that correct?" "Yes, I was in charge of collecting data, everything from productivity scores to team demographics." Marcus walked slowly toward the jury, making sure their eyes stayed on him. He wanted them to feel the significance of what was about to come. "Mr. Rodriguez, in the course of your work, did you notice any patterns in how layoffs were distributed?" David cleared his throat. "Yes, there were clear patterns. Employees of color, especially Black and Latino workers, were being laid off at a disproportionately high rate, much higher than their white counterparts, even when performance ratings were the same or better." Marcus nodded, the calm satisfaction in his voice sharpening. "And did you raise any concerns with the company about this pattern?" "I did," David said. "I sent an internal report to my supervisor outlining the disparities." "And what happened next?" David's jaw tightened. "I was told to drop the matter. They said it wasn't my place to analyze hiring decisions. A few months later, I was let go in the next round of layoffs." The jury exchanged glances, and Marcus knew he had their attention. He walked over to the evidence table and lifted a thick folder. "Your Honor," he said, addressing the judge, "I'd like to introduce Exhibit 17. A report prepared by Mr. Rodriguez that outlines the statistical disparities in the company's layoffs." Jonathan Price shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. The data is speculative. There's no proof the layoffs were based on race." Marcus turned toward Jonathan, a cool smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "Mr. Price, if the data shows that employees of color were laid off at twice the rate of their peers, with no correlation to performance, how exactly do you define speculation?" The judge raised an eyebrow at Jonathan. "Overruled. Let's hear what Mr. Rodriguez has to say." Jonathan sat back down, visibly frustrated. Marcus fought the urge to smile outright. He could see it now. Jonathan was starting to realize that charm and theatrics wouldn't save him here. "Mr. Rodriguez," Marcus continued, "walk us through the report. What did the numbers show?" David adjusted his glasses, speaking more confidently now. "The layoffs disproportionately affected minority employees, especially in higher-paying roles. In fact, in some departments, every employee let go during the restructuring belonged to a minority group, while less qualified white employees were retained." The room grew still as the weight of the testimony settled over the jurors. Marcus could feel the case tilting further in his favor, like a chess match where his opponent had walked into a trap without realizing it. He allowed a brief silence to hang in the air before continuing. "Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. No further questions." Marcus returned to his seat, satisfied. Now came the part he enjoyed the most, watching Price squirm. Jonathan rose slowly from his chair, smoothing down his tie, as if he were preparing to charm his way out of a pit. "Mr. Rodriguez," Jonathan began, his voice measured, "you mentioned that performance metrics were part of your analysis. Isn't it true that productivity can fluctuate? Employees might have a good quarter, but that doesn't guarantee long-term performance." David crossed his arms. "That's true, but the metrics I used were consistent over multiple review periods. The employees who were fired had steady performance, better than many who were kept." Jonathan forced a smile, but Marcus saw the cracks forming beneath the surface. "And isn't it possible that the company's restructuring focused on business needs rather than personal biases?" David shook his head firmly. "If that were the case, the layoffs wouldn't align so closely with race. The numbers don't lie." Jonathan faltered for a moment, then regrouped. "Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. No further questions." He sat down quickly, like a man retreating from a battlefield he knew he was losing. As the judge called for a recess, Jonathan rubbed his temples, frustration etched into every line of his face. He was unraveling, and Marcus could sense it. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Marcus leaned casually against the wall, waiting for his team to regroup. Jonathan stormed past him, muttering under his breath, but then stopped abruptly and turned around. "You think you've got this wrapped up, don't you?" Jonathan sneered. Marcus met his gaze calmly. "I think I have the truth on my side. That's usually enough." Jonathan scoffed, but there was no real bite in it. "You're a smart guy, Williams. I'll give you that. But smart doesn't always win. Power does." Marcus tilted his head, smiling without warmth. "Then it's a good thing I've got both." Jonathan's face twisted into a bitter scowl, but he said nothing more. He turned on his heel and stalked away, shoulders stiff with frustration. Marcus watched him go, feeling a quiet sense of victory. The trial wasn't over yet, but the tide had turned, and he knew it. The thing about men like Jonathan Price was that they relied on their opponents crumbling under pressure. But Marcus didn't crumble. He thrived under pressure. As he returned to the courtroom, Marcus allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The battle wasn't just about winning the case, it was about showing men like Price that their assumptions had no place here. And when the final verdict came, it would be more than just a legal win. It would be a reckoning. Shadow games and betrayals. The courtroom resumed after recess, and with it came a new atmosphere, more subdued, more focused. Marcus Williams could feel the invisible threads of tension pulling tighter between himself, Jonathan Price, the jury, and even the judge. Each side was playing a game, but it was no longer just legal strategy. It had become psychological warfare. Every pause, every glance, every objection carried more weight now. Marcus had spent years honing his ability to thrive in these moments, where doubt could sink or save a case. Jonathan, on the other hand, was trying to salvage control, and Marcus could see the cracks widening with each passing minute. The defense's next move came with a surprise, an attempt to undermine one of Marcus's witnesses by introducing Sharon Grayson, a human resources consultant. Marcus hadn't expected her testimony to be central, but the corporation had pulled a sly maneuver. If Sharon could plant seeds of doubt about the credibility of the layoffs being discriminatory, Marcus's carefully built narrative could begin to erode. Jonathan Price stood confidently, his earlier frustration now masked behind a polished smile. "Ms. Grayson, you've reviewed the restructuring process carried out by my client. In your professional opinion, did the layoffs follow standard corporate policy?" Sharon, dressed in a tailored suit with the poise of someone well-versed in crisis management, gave a smooth nod. "Yes, they did. The layoffs were aligned with industry standards, focusing on streamlining redundant roles. There is no evidence to suggest that race played any factor in these decisions. Marcus leaned back in his chair, masking his irritation. This was a typical corporate move, bringing in an expert to sanitize the narrative. But Marcus knew that corporate policies, on paper, meant little when the real decisions happened behind closed doors. Sharon's job was to make everything look squeaky clean. Jonathan pressed further. Ms. Grayson, in your years of experience, have you seen restructuring processes similar to this one? Many times, she said with a practiced smile. And it's common for employees to feel targeted, but personal grievances don't equate to actual discrimination. Jonathan threw a quick glance at Marcus, as if daring him to challenge the testimony. Marcus met his gaze coolly. He wasn't biting. Not yet. Let them play their hand. When it was Marcus's turn to cross-examine, he stood slowly, straightening his jacket. He approached the witness stand like a predator circling prey. Not aggressive, just deliberate. Ms. Grayson, Marcus began with a polite nod. You mentioned that the layoffs were aligned with industry standards. Can you clarify what those standards are? Sharon smiled, folding her hands neatly on her lap. Certainly. Companies often look at overlapping roles, departmental budgets, and long-term financial goals to determine which positions can be eliminated. Marcus clasped his hands behind his back, pacing slowly. Interesting. And in your review, did you personally evaluate the demographic breakdown of the layoffs? Sharon's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a crack too small for most to notice, but Marcus didn't miss it. I reviewed the general structure, but I wasn't tasked with analyzing demographic data specifically. Marcus pounced. So you didn't examine whether the layoffs disproportionately affected employees of color? Sharon's eyes flickered toward Jonathan, seeking a lifeline, but Jonathan gave her nothing. No, that wasn't part of my review. Marcus smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Then you're not really in a position to say whether race was a factor, are you? She shifted uncomfortably. I can say that the process followed corporate guidelines. Marcus cut her off, his tone sharp but controlled. Guidelines that ignore the impact on marginalized employees, correct? Jonathan leaped to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is badgering the witness. The judge gave Marcus a warning look. Sustained. Mr. Williams, stick to questions. Marcus held up his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. Of course, Your Honor. He turned back to Sharon, his expression neutral. Ms. Grayson, one last question. Wouldn't it be fair to say that just because something follows corporate policy doesn't mean it's fair or just? Sharon hesitated, but she couldn't deny the point without looking foolish. In some cases, yes. Marcus nodded, satisfied. Thank you. No further questions. As Marcus returned to his seat, he caught the look of irritation on Jonathan's face. It wasn't a decisive blow, but it was enough to plant a seed of doubt in the jury's mind. Corporate policies were often tools of convenience, designed to shield, not reveal. And Marcus was starting to expose the rot beneath the shiny exterior. The next few hours dragged on with witness after witness, most of them inconsequential. But Marcus's mind wasn't on the current testimony. He was already thinking 3 steps ahead. He needed a trump card, something that would cut through the corporate jargon and show the jury exactly what was at stake. Then it hit him. He knew exactly what he needed. Internal emails, the kind that no HR consultant could smooth over. During the lunch break, Marcus called in a favor from his tech consultant, Lisa Cho. She specialized in digital forensics and had a knack for finding the kind of evidence that corporations buried deep in their servers, hoping no one would uncover it. I need dirt, Marcus said. Anything incriminating in their internal communications, something that shows intent behind the layoffs. A smoking gun. Lisa chuckled on the other end of the line. You always ask for miracles, Marcus. But I like a challenge. I'll dig into their files and see what I can find. By the time the afternoon session began, Marcus felt a renewed sense of focus. He had set the trap. Now he just needed to keep Jonathan and the corporation busy until Lisa delivered. The defense called another witness, Paul Redding, the company's vice president, who was brought in to defend the decision-making process. Marcus watched him closely. Redding carried himself with the same arrogance as Jonathan, a man used to getting his way with little resistance. Jonathan's questions were smooth and rehearsed, painting Redding as a competent leader making tough but necessary decisions to protect the company's future. Redding's answers were precise, but his smile reeked of insincerity. When Marcus took the floor to cross-examine, the room seemed to quiet as if sensing the shift in momentum. Marcus knew exactly how to poke holes in a man like Redding. He stepped forward, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp. "Mr. Redding," Marcus began, "you mentioned earlier that these layoffs were intended to align with the company's financial goals. Can you tell us how the layoffs were communicated internally?" Redding shrugged, as if the question was beneath him. "We issued standard notices. It's a typical process." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "And did you personally approve those notices?" "Yes. I sign off on all major personnel changes." "Interesting," Marcus said, taking a step closer. "So, would you say you were directly involved in deciding which employees to let go?" Redding shifted in his seat, sensing where the conversation was headed. "I had final oversight, but the decisions were based on recommendations from department heads." Marcus tilted his head, pretending to be puzzled. "So, if one of those recommendations was influenced by personal bias, say, against employees of color, you would have approved it without knowing?" Jonathan shot up from his chair. "Objection. Speculation." The judge gave Marcus a warning glance. "Sustained." Marcus smiled inwardly. He didn't need to press harder. He had already planted doubt in the jury's mind. Now they would start questioning how thorough Redding's oversight really was. Before Marcus could ask another question, his phone buzzed in his pocket. A message from Lisa. "Got something. Check your email." Marcus kept his expression neutral, but excitement surged through him. Whatever Lisa had found, he knew it would be important. "I have no further questions at this time, Your Honor," Marcus said, returning to his seat. During a brief recess, Marcus opened the email from Lisa. Attached were several internal memos and emails between executives, including Paul Redding himself. One subject line immediately caught his attention. "Diversity isn't our priority right now." Marcus scanned the message quickly. In the email, Redding had written to department heads instructing them to prioritize layoffs that would have the least financial impact, followed by a statement that was damning. "Let's be honest. Some roles are harder to cut without raising eyebrows. Use your judgment, but we don't need PR headaches about quotas." It was subtle, but the implication was clear, corporate jargon masking discriminatory intent. The defense had painted the layoffs as standard procedure, but this email proved otherwise. Marcus forwarded the email to himself, prepared to use it at the right moment. It wasn't just a crack in their defense. It was a full-blown fracture. When court resumed, Marcus felt the energy shift around him. Jonathan Price was still coasting on his earlier smugness, but it wouldn't last long. Marcus stood, holding a copy of the email printout in his hand. "Your Honor," Marcus began, addressing the judge with calm authority, "I'd like to enter new evidence into the record." Jonathan's expression froze. "Objection, Your Honor. This is last-minute evidence." The judge cut him off. "Overruled. Let's see it." Marcus handed the email to the judge and opposing counsel, then turned to the jury with deliberate calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you're looking at is an internal memo written by the defendant's vice president, Paul Redding. This memo reveals not only the priorities behind the layoffs, but also the dismissive attitude toward diversity." Jonathan's face paled as he frantically flipped through the pages, his earlier confidence unraveling. "The defense has argued that these layoffs were standard," Marcus continued, "but this memo shows otherwise. It exposes the real reason behind the layoffs, one carefully hidden beneath corporate doublespeak." He turned to Paul Redding, who now sat stiffly in the witness box, visibly uncomfortable. "Mr. Redding, Care to explain what you meant by, "We don't need PR headaches about quotas"? Redding opened his mouth, but no words came out. Jonathan jumped in, desperate. "Objection. This is being taken out of context." Marcus turned sharply to Jonathan, his voice rising just enough to cut through the courtroom. "Context. The context is clear, Mr. Price. Your client was more concerned with avoiding public scrutiny than treating their employees fairly." The courtroom was silent, the weight of Marcus's words sinking in. The jury exchanged glances, their expressions serious. They weren't just hearing legal arguments, they were seeing the truth for what it was. As Marcus returned to his seat, he saw Jonathan slump slightly in his chair, the swagger finally gone. The man who had taunted Marcus in the parking lot now looked lost, scrambling to contain the fallout of a case spiraling out of his control. For the first time, Marcus allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. The tide had turned, and Jonathan Price knew it, breaking the facade. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs after Marcus introduced the damning email into evidence. Jonathan Price sat at the defense table, frantically flipping through papers, trying to concoct a response to the bombshell Marcus had just dropped. The judge banged her gavel twice, restoring order. "Counselor Price," she said sternly, "if you intend to challenge this evidence, you may do so in your next round of questioning." Jonathan forced a tight smile and gave a curt nod, though his eyes betrayed panic. He had lost control of the narrative, and he knew it. Marcus leaned back in his chair, observing the courtroom like a hunter watching a wounded prey. The carefully constructed image of corporate dynamics, efficient, fair, and future-focused, was cracking under the weight of Redding's email. But Marcus wasn't done. He had one more move to make, and he intended to make it count. When the defense called Margaret Levin, the company's public relations director, to the stand, Marcus knew it was an act of desperation. Margaret was supposed to act as damage control, putting a positive spin on the layoffs and downplaying the email as a misunderstanding. Marcus watched her intently as Jonathan guided her through friendly questions. She was polished, well-prepared, and unflinching under Jonathan's line of questioning, a textbook corporate spin doctor. "As you can see," Margaret said with a rehearsed smile, "our leadership team made difficult but necessary choices to ensure long-term stability. And while that memo could be misinterpreted out of context, I can assure you it does not reflect the values of corporate dynamics." When it was Marcus's turn to cross-examine, he took his time rising from his seat, letting the silence hang just a little too long, enough to make Margaret shift uneasily in the witness box. "Ms. Levin," Marcus began, his voice calm and measured. "As the head of public relations, it's your job to protect the company's reputation, correct?" Margaret smiled thinly. "That's part of it, yes. And I imagine you've had to deal with a fair number of public complaints during your time at Corporate Dynamics. Of course, every large corporation faces public scrutiny from time to time." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Have you ever had to handle complaints related to discrimination?" Margaret's smile faltered for a split second, but she recovered quickly. "I can't recall specific cases, but I imagine it has come up, as it does in most industries." Marcus leaned in slightly, narrowing his gaze. "I'm sure it does. And when it does your company conduct internal investigations into those complaints?" Margaret hesitated, sensing a trap. "We take all complaints seriously and follow up as appropriate." Marcus smiled. Just a hint, enough to unsettle her. "That wasn't my question. I asked if you conduct investigations, yes or no." "Yes," she admitted reluctantly. "Good," Marcus said, pacing slowly in front of the jury. "Now let's talk about timing. This particular email from Mr. Redding, dated 2 weeks before the layoffs, mentions avoiding PR headaches about quotas. Were you aware of this email before today?" Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "No, I was not." "Interesting," Marcus said, turning to face the jury. "So the head of public relations, someone whose job it is to manage public perception, was kept in the dark about a memo discussing the company's approach to diversity. Jonathan shifted uncomfortably at the defense table. Margaret's silence confirmed what the jury was already beginning to suspect. There was more to the story, and it wasn't good. Marcus pressed on. "Let me ask you this, Ms. Levin. If you had known about this memo, would you have recommended a different approach to the layoffs?" Margaret hesitated, her professional demeanor slipping for the first time. "That's a hypothetical question, Mr. Bell." "Yes, it is," Marcus said smoothly. "But humor me. If your company truly valued diversity and fairness, wouldn't it have been your duty to raise concerns about such language?" Margaret's jaw tightened. "I suppose, yes. And yet," Marcus continued, his voice sharpening, "no such concerns were raised, were they? In fact, your company moved forward with layoffs that disproportionately affected employees from minority backgrounds." Jonathan sprang to his feet. "Objection. This is speculation." Marcus turned to the judge, calm but firm. "Your Honor, the data shows a clear pattern. It's not speculation. It's fact." The judge nodded. "Overruled. Proceed." Marcus walked slowly toward the witness stand, his gaze never leaving Margaret's. "Ms. Levin, one final question. In your professional opinion, do you believe corporate dynamics acted in good faith when implementing these layoffs?" Margaret's shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of the question, and the truth bearing down on her. She looked at Jonathan, hoping for some sign of support, but found none. After a long pause, she exhaled quietly. "I don't know." The courtroom went silent. Marcus let her answer hang in the air for a moment, then gave a small nod. No further questions. As he returned to his seat, he saw the jurors exchange glances, their expressions grim. The truth had landed like a punch to the gut, and there was no spinning it. Jonathan tried to salvage what little ground he had left during his closing arguments, but the damage was done. His smooth-talking charm was no match for the raw facts Marcus had laid bare. When Marcus gave his closing argument, he didn't rely on theatrics or grand gestures. He simply spoke from the heart, reminding the jury that at its core, this case was about accountability. "Corporate dynamics wants you to believe that they acted out of necessity," Marcus said, his voice steady and unwavering. "But necessity doesn't excuse injustice. They want you to believe that the layoffs were just business. But business should never come at the expense of fairness. These employees, our plaintiffs, deserve more than a cold dismissal. They deserve justice." As Marcus sat down, he felt the weight of the room settle over him like a warm blanket. The jury's faces told him everything he needed to know. Jonathan Price sat rigidly, his jaw clenched, knowing that the case had slipped beyond his grasp. No amount of corporate jargon could undo the damage Marcus had inflicted. And for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in years. A sense of triumph, not just for himself, but for those who had been wronged. The truth had been exposed, and now justice was within reach. The judge announced that the jury would reconvene in the morning to deliberate. As the courtroom emptied, Marcus gathered his papers, feeling the buzz of victory coursing through him. Jonathan brushed past him on the way out, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. "This isn't over," he hissed under his breath. Marcus smiled calmly. "Oh, Jonathan, it's just beginning." The verdict looms. The night before the jury's deliberation was sleepless for Marcus. Despite the steady confidence he had projected in court, the weight of uncertainty gnawed at him. A lifetime of experience had taught him that justice was never guaranteed, especially against a corporate giant with endless resources. He sat at his kitchen table, a tumbler of bourbon untouched before him. Case files were scattered around, illuminated by the soft glow of a single lamp. His phone buzzed, dragging him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Samantha, the lead plaintiff in the case. "Samantha, no matter what happens tomorrow, thank you. You gave us a voice." Marcus stared at the message, the words hitting him harder than he expected. He knew how deeply this case mattered to the plaintiffs. Workers who had been discarded, their careers derailed in an instant. They weren't just names on a legal document. They were people who had trusted him to make things right. He finally typed a response. "Whatever happens, we're not done yet. See you in court tomorrow." Setting the phone down, Marcus leaned back in his chair. The stakes were higher than ever, not just for the plaintiffs, but for himself. This wasn't just another legal battle. Winning would mean more than a favorable verdict. It would be proof that even the biggest corporations could be held accountable. And for Marcus Bell, that was worth everything. The next day, courtroom 3B. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as everyone filed in. Marcus noticed the plaintiffs huddled in quiet conversation, their eyes full of hope and anxiety. Across the room, Jonathan Price sat rigidly, his fingers drumming against the defense table. He had discarded the casual confidence he once wore, replaced by a cold veneer of professionalism, a mask cracking under pressure. The bailiff entered and called for silence. "All rise." Everyone stood as the judge made her way to the bench. Marcus could feel the weight of every gaze in the room. Plaintiffs, defense attorneys, reporters scribbling furiously in their notebooks, and even the spectators who had followed the case from the beginning. The jury had reached a decision. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense expression, stood slowly as the judge asked, "Have you reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor," she replied, holding a folded piece of paper. The courtroom was still, save for the soft rustling of the paper being handed to the judge. Marcus folded his hands in front of him, every muscle tensed in anticipation. The judge glanced down at the paper, her expression neutral, unreadable. "In the matter of Samantha Turner et al. Versus corporate dynamics, we find in favor of." She paused, and time seemed to stretch unbearably. The plaintiffs. A wave of relief swept through the plaintiff's side of the courtroom. Samantha let out an audible gasp, clasping her hands over her mouth, while another plaintiff wiped tears from his eyes. Marcus allowed himself a small smile, feeling the tension that had coiled inside him finally release. But the victory was bittersweet. As the judge continued reading the decision, detailing damages awarded for wrongful termination, discrimination, and emotional distress, it became clear just how deep corporate dynamics negligence had run. The jury's findings were damning, painting a picture of a company more concerned with optics and profitability than with fairness or humanity. Across the courtroom, Jonathan Price sat motionless, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles twitched. Marcus could almost hear the gears turning in Jonathan's mind, already planning the next steps, likely preparing an appeal. But Marcus knew that today's victory was a blow from which corporate dynamics would not easily recover. The court of public opinion would be just as harsh as the legal system, if not harsher. When the judge finally dismissed the court, chaos erupted. Plaintiffs hugged each other and thanked Marcus profusely. Reporters surged forward, shouting questions and shoving microphones in his face. Marcus raised a hand to signal silence. "I'll make a statement outside," he said firmly, cutting through the noise. "No questions in here." He turned to Samantha, who was still struggling to find words. "This is your victory," he said softly. "You fought for it, and you won." Samantha wiped away tears, smiling through the flood of emotions. "We couldn't have done it without you." Outside the courthouse, the media frenzy. The courthouse steps were packed with reporters, cameras flashing in rapid bursts as Marcus and the plaintiffs emerged into the sunlight. Marcus took his place behind a podium hastily set up for press statements, flanked by Samantha and the other plaintiffs. He waited for the noise to die down before speaking. "Today's verdict isn't just a win for these brave individuals," Marcus began, his voice steady but full of conviction. "It's a win for every worker who's been cast aside, every person who's been told they're just a statistic. Corporate dynamics thought they could avoid accountability. They thought that fairness was optional. Today, we proved them wrong." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. "This case was about more than layoffs or memos," Marcus continued. "It was about dignity, about the principle that no corporation, no matter how large, can operate without respect for its people. He paused, letting the words sink in. We hope this verdict sends a message to every company out there. Do better. Be better. Because if you don't, we'll be right here, ready to hold you accountable. The crowd erupted in applause, and Marcus stepped back, allowing the plaintiffs to take the spotlight. Samantha spoke next, her voice still shaky but full of pride. We fought for justice, she said, and today we got it. Later that evening, Marcus's office. The celebration at the courthouse had lasted hours. But now, back in the quiet of his office, Marcus allowed himself a rare moment of solitude. He stood by the window, looking out over the city skyline, a soft smile tugging at his lips. His phone buzzed on the desk, another congratulatory message, no doubt. But this time, Marcus didn't need validation from anyone else. He knew he had done right by his clients, and that was enough. As he reached for his coat, preparing to head home, he noticed a folder sitting on the edge of his desk. Jonathan Price's notice of appeal. Marcus chuckled softly. Of course, corporate dynamics wasn't going down without a fight. But that was fine. If Jonathan wanted to drag this battle out, Marcus was more than ready. This wasn't the end. It was just another beginning.